a presentation on their work and how it relates to Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook's work. And that'll be followed by a discussion between us where we'll pull some of the ideas together, and then we'll turn the volume back on, and you can see some of the videos of the show. You've seen them already, and you can also come back until the show closes on March 30th. We would like to see the show without a bunch of chairs in it. I'll just quickly introduce our speakers, and we can go ahead and get started. Gruen is currently professor of philosophy, feminist, gender, sexuality studies, and environmental studies at Wesleyan University, where she also coordinates Wesleyan animal studies. Professor Gruen has published extensively on topics of animal ethics, ecofeminism, empathy, and death. She is the author of 3 books on animal ethics, including Entangled Empathy, and Ethics in Animals, and Introduction. And she's edited 5 books, including Ecofeminism, Feminist Intersections with Other Animals on the Earth, Carol J. Adams, and the Ethics of Captivity, and the Ecofeminism book we have interested, and Arnika Fuhrmann, who is Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at Cornell University, and an interdisciplinary scholar of Southeast Asia, working at the intersections of the region's aesthetic and political modernities. Her book manuscript, Ghostly Desires, forthcoming with Duke University Press, examines how Buddhist-coded anachronisms of haunting figure and struggles over sexuality, personhood, and notions of collectivity in contemporary Thai cinema. So we'll start with Arnika.
Thank you so much, Ruba. When I first met Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook, probably 15 years ago, she probably knew. Hello, is this better? Hello. Is the microphone working? It's working. It's better. Okay. So I just wanted to say, when I first met Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook about 15 years ago, I would never have imagined a show like this, and I just really wanted to congratulate you again on putting together this really beautiful work, and thank you for including me in the evening as well. So what I want to do, I should take this off the stand. What I want to do is speak a little bit about Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook's work on death and desire in this presentation. And this work is collected in a total of 3 catalogs. The first of which is called Peng Pratana, or Lament of Desire. The second is called Thamaiถึงมีรสกวีแทนความรู้ทัน? Why is it poetry rather than awareness? And the third is called ศิลปะกับถ้อยความ, art and words. And these catalogs archive work that the artist made from roughly the mid-1990s to about 2005 or 2006, when she returned to a morgue, a hospital morgue in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand over and over again to film corpses in different scenes and arrangements, and then to make installation videos with these films. And I think this work is important because what I think it does is it lays the groundwork or prefigures some of the later work that you see exhibited here as well, that she does with animals, with women in a mental hospital, or with villagers who critique art. What her work on death parses for us is, I think, the instability of a coherent, unified human subject. And it shows us the inability of this subject to assume a monopoly on agency or a monopoly on meaning. So in these almost 10 years, what she creates is a very in-depth critique of the notion of individual human sovereignty. And what she then does is she expands the notion of sovereignty, of agency, and of meaning-making into the worlds of the dead, animals, and those who are considered mad. And I'll just speak for about 20 minutes or less. on these videos that she made from the mid-1990s to 2005. And I'll have some slides to accompany them. So Making Contact was the title of contemporary Thai artist Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook's video work on death, presented at the 2005 Venice Biennale. Her performance videos were exhibited in the Thai Pavilion, where they were juxtaposed with the work. Sorry, this is wrong. Where they were juxtaposed with the work of the late Fuhrmann. The title of the joint Thai exhibition, presented at an old convent, was "Those Dying Wishing to Stay, Those Living Preparing to Leave." Araya's performance videos were installed in the cloister walk of the convent, where they were projected onto screens hung just slightly above the memorial slabs on the floor. In the video, "This Is Our Creation," you can see the artist lying on the ground between 6 corpses, softly speaking a poetic text and singing a children's song. Conversation 1 to 3 shows her sitting with and humming to corpses in a carefully timed video collage, and there's a version of that in this exhibition as well. In the class and death seminar, both of which are here, Araya teaches classes on the subject of death to the dead. Making contact with the dead was not new work for Araya Rasdjarmrearnsook. The Venice videos culminate the artist's almost decade-long occupation with death. I investigate Araya's willed and long-term history of intimacy and exchange with the dead, not for its treatment of mourning, but rather for how the artist sketches out a feminist anatomy of desire in an idiom of negativity. And when I refer to the artist, I use her first name because this is how you reference Thai authors and artists. But in the catalog, we all used her last name, but it's 1 syllable longer. So this might be easier. So Araya's work situates desire in a highly abstracted scene of loss and unrelenting attachment. In her videos with corpses in the hygienic clinical environment of the morgue, the artist directs discourses of longing toward objects of desire who can no longer respond. The artist's reconfiguration of relationality thus relies on eroticizing contingency and performing reversals between the living and the dead. The particular status of the dead, their inability to give consent, allows the artist to push questions of desire and agency to unfamiliar limits. So if you're going to spend almost a decade making films about death and desire, you had better tell us something unfamiliar and new about desire. Throughout these 8 to 10 years that she makes these films, you see them change from these very sort of austere, hygienic setups where she stays far away from the corpses and interacts with them only through her voice, to videos such as Thai Medley from 2002 or I'm Living, which is presented behind you, where her modes of interacting with the dead diversify. And she sings, she reads her own erotic writing, she continues to read classical Thai literature, passages of flirtation and love poetry. But she also dresses the dead, she dresses herself, and is in general much more playful in her approach to the dead. It is the piece Conversation of Two Women from 1998, frequently cited by the artist herself, that best illustrates how the performances in the morgue come to enable what Lauren Berlant has called minor intimacies. In Conversation, Araya probes the potential of death to represent a space for as yet impossible intimacies. In this video, Araya reads to the corpse of a young woman. Filmed at a descending angle, the image of the young woman is moreover slightly blurred. Only the upper half of her body is visible. She is lying in a drawer in the morgue that has been pulled out. Her head is propped up on a pillow, and she is dressed in a colorful blouse. There is blood on the pillow next to her head. The young woman is one of the dead whose beauty and biography of love-suicide, as Araya says, compelled the artist to perform with and for her. To To the left of the drawer, a white sheet of text indicates the performer's presence at the young woman's side. And this is just one of the installation views of the same piece. The English caption of Conversation of Two Women in the catalog reads, "In the second room, a conversation between two women. One is alive, one is dead. The sound is a conversation during a love scene between a man and his lover, their parting in the beginning of a new love." As Araya recites a passage from the Inao, a classical Thai literary text that she references as female-authored, she reads the direct speech of the male lover to the dead woman. Directly addressing the young woman as a lover, the artist can be perceived to reenact the scene of attachment and desire in a gesture of consolation. Alternatively, she may be heard cruelly to underline the loss of life and loss of love that has occurred. And these are two interpretations that came up at a public event in Thailand. But however one understands the video, it is clear that what the artist calls the movement of desire of this reading circulates between at least four persons: the artist, the dead woman, the figure of the male lover from the Inao, from the classical text, and the woman that he speaks to. Although various readings of the address in this video are possible, at least one of the movements of desire that occurs in the performance is between two women, the performer and the dead woman. When the figure of the performer directly addresses the dead woman as a lover, speaking traditional terms of endearment from classical Thai poetry to her, the video thus makes the desire between women its issue. The exact nature of this desire is left open by the video. It is not lesbian desire per se that is depicted here. Rather, the scene can be read as a longing for the open-ended movement of desire that this particular object of address enables. The affective relation that becomes possible in the address of the classical text to the dead woman centrally includes homoerotic desire, yet it can be said to incorporate other forms of desire as well. The scene from Conversation described above illustrates how the performance of a particular form of continued attachment to a lost object can be correlated with affective relations or forms of desire that are either non-normative or not easily classified. And this will repeat throughout so many of her videos. In her video work, Araya thus creates a concise artistic language for intimacies that otherwise have no designation. As the artist passes from body to body and from group to group of corpses throughout her different videos, it becomes clear that her performances do not represent rites for individual lost objects, in which case death ritual would tend to be personalized, commemorative, and come to some kind of completion. The mass of the dead and the repetition of the scenes instead suggest that the dead in these videos stand in for still something else. As Araya dramatizes the condition of contingency in these performances, the lines between the dead and the living are blurred, and the performer is seen almost to merge with the dead. This becomes evident most literally in A Walk from 2002, where the artist moves through rows of corpses. As her silent walk is shown in slow motion, the figure of the artist becomes a blur, and she appears as a wandering vinyan, a spirit or a soul among the gurneys, as she says. A Walk thus visually exemplifies the merging with the dead that Araya performs throughout her work. As much as the artist aligns herself with the dead and performs her own contingency, however, she also performs her survival or her difference from the dead each time that she leaves a video and enters the frame of the next. The conventions of play become especially important in this context. I'm Living, which is shown or exhibited right behind you, is a video in which the artist plays dress-up with the body of a young woman. In the video, the corpse of a young woman lies on a white sheet on the ground. The camera provides a static image of the dead woman's body from above. Her body is wet and a negligee-like garment is draped over it. Her head is turned to her right and her wet hair is spread out around her head. The artist in a white dress comes in with a stack of clothes. She dresses the young woman's corpse first in pants and a shirt, then in a dress, then puts a second dress on top of the first. The artist continues carefully to drape clothing onto the woman's body. She holds some of the colorful and flower print dresses on herself first and continues her work, variously kneeling to the left and right of the body. In producing video works with subjects who cannot consent, the artist enters a particular zone of risk and polysemy, so the ability to have many meanings at once. While I do not want to evaluate the ethical import of the artist's engagement with the dead, even though it's something that people constantly ask about, I think it's nevertheless instructive to consider the issue of consent in this context. I think it's very central to what makes up the conceptual power of this work. Because the dead were once living human beings and continue to signify as human, the question of consent remains pertinent. Carolyn Anderson and Thomas Benson used the case of the documentary The Titicut Follies, a film about a hospital for the criminally insane, to probe the limits of consent in artistic production. The problems regarding the consent of the subjects filmed in The Titicut Follies include the fact that, quote, the incarcerated subjects could not provide informed consent in any usual sense of that word. Also, at the time that consent was given, the exact shape that the film would take in the end was as yet unclear. And at the time that the filmmaker acquired consent, it was impossible to gauge the effects that his film would have, that is, whether it would benefit the subjects involved. So these considerations of a complex case of an American documentary make clear the precariousness of the consent of subjects whose agency or informedness might be compromised in some way. Taking the dead as its subjects, Araya's video work pushes the issue of consent into a terrain of further precarity and temporal complexity. The artist is working with subjects who still signify as human, but can no longer consent to their involvement in this artwork. Even if they had given consent while still alive, the question of the validity of this consent after death would remain. The artist's engagement with subjects whose status as subjects is unclear and whose consent she cannot obtain thus calls into question the parameters of agency and the problematics of power even further. With the production of these videos, Araya enters a particular terrain of unknowability. Each time the artist enters the morgue, the room is thus full of questions that cannot be answered. Is this a violation of the dead? Is this an entry into culpability on the part of the artist? Or does this performance constitute a Buddhist kind of merit-making, acquiring merit for the dead? Do these performances affect the artist herself in a harmful manner, or could all of the above be the case? In the exhibition of the finished artwork, I understand these questions to translate into a performance of radical risk on the part of the artist, as well as to produce a field of polysemy for the performer's actions with the dead. So I think it opens up meaning even further than other pieces with other subjects could. I am most interested in how the artist's engagement with subjects whose status as subjects is unclear and whose consent she cannot obtain allows her to explore the mobility of desiring positions in a highly experimental way. This becomes clear in I'm Living, in which the dynamics of play further highlight the notion of such mobility. Laying ever new outfits on the woman's body, the artist captions the video. Paper doll lives in an exercise book, rooms drawn with lines, she is dressing, end of quote. Perhaps more than any other video, I'm Living exemplifies the taking on of multiple subject positions that play allows for. I am dressing her, I am being dressed by her, I want her to do something to me, she wants to do, I want her to do something to me, she wants to do something to me, I'm living, I'm dead, I'm in control of the fantasy, I'm not. Film scholar Linda Williams has stressed the mobility of women's desiring positions in horror film and sadomasochistic fantasy. And Linda Williams summarizes her claim about this as follows. She says, fantasy is not so much a narrative that enacts the quest for an object of desire, as it is a setting for desire, a place where conscious and unconscious, self and other, part and whole meet. Fantasy is the place where desubjectified subjectivities oscillate between self and other, occupying no fixed place in the scenario. So in particular, Williams uses this theory to make masochistic and other positions of seeming disempowerment available to women's pleasure. So to give agency to a subject who doesn't seem to have any in a sort of conventional perspective. Araya's work exemplifies the mobility of fantasy that Williams argues for in very ideal terms. The objects/subjects who become Araya's counterparts in the scene of desire represent strong cases both of non-agency and impersonality. The field of signification that the artist creates further allows for the performance of radical instability also with regard to the subjectivity of the living woman in the videos. And the enacting of fluctuation in female subjectivity also becomes a central component of the ideal envisioned by the artist. The female subject that emerges from these exchanges with the dead at once confidently proclaims the desire for attachments that are non-normative or as yet impossible, and shows herself as disintegrating in the process. And this happens both within the videos, but also in sort of the artist's own framing of her work in catalog texts and captions and interviews. Araya's work therefore models a desiring subject that is not primarily based on the notion of sovereign subjectivity, but rather on a female self oscillating between disintegration and survival, between will and subjection to the conditions of loss and contingency. Because the question of the transgression of the boundaries of others always stands in their background, and because the artist consistently performs the transgression of bounds of the self, these videos provide a highly polysemic context for experimentation with the limits of agency, power, and desire. As Araya's performances turn the morgue into a place in which fantasy, play, melancholy, and intimacy come together, the discrepancies of register, tone, and signification that so strongly mark her work also let it become a concentrated study of contingency and of its potential to hold open a space for intimacies beyond the normative schemes of couplehood and other sort of normative things that we're used to. As contingency is literalized in the morgue in its two partially competing implications of open to chance on the one hand and subject to accident and loss on the other hand, the artist is able to express something fundamental about desire itself, about its accidental nature and its non-directability, as well as about its boundedness. As art that centrally foregrounds images, idioms, and affects of loss on the one hand, and women's sexual desire on the other hand, Araya's work further picks up on conventional visual uses of female death and its pleasurable witnessing. So her videos defamiliarize both Buddhist conventions of using dead female bodies as teaching tools, and then it also defamiliarizes the ways in which contemporary Thai cinema improvises on this convention in numerous films of haunting, where the viewing pleasure lies in the viewer seeing the highly embodied previously dead and then returned to life as a ghost woman, exorcised and her body destroyed, often in a very physical sense. So here female death comes to be a kind of special effect, and this Buddhist convention is mobilized by contemporary Thai cinema. But Araya's, and this is something that everyone would be very familiar with in Thailand, but what Araya does is she defamiliarizes these conventions to such an extent that they cease to function as a vehicle for conservative modes of recovering Thai femininity, or just for satisfying a certain kind of viewing pleasure. The artist's work thereby intervenes in a dominant convention that lets trajectories of women's desire seem largely inevitable. By situating fantasy in realist settings and refusing the tonality of the spectacular and predictable that marks this convention and sort of heritage art more generally, Araya instead invests the domains of femininity and loss with open-ended possibilities for plots and trajectories of being, desiring, and relating. Lending feminist meaning to a convention with a partially anti-feminist history, Araya's work manipulates Buddhist-derived convention to voice a complaint about the status quo regarding women's desires. The video's dominant visual register of hygiene disbars cultural nationalist elements from the sphere of death. The use of poetic language in Buddhist form, on the other hand, brings counterfactual possibility into the scenes of temporal incongruity that are presented in these pieces. Rather than reiterate Buddhist pedagogy, the videos draw on a popular Buddhist ontological framework that suggests that the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable. Thank you.
So I forgot to mention that Arnika did contribute to the publication that's accompanying this exhibition, which is also.
Hi, I'm Gruen, and I just want to thank Ruba for the brilliant insight that she had to put together this show and then to think about it through a lens of ecofeminism. And so what I'm going to do is try to highlight and talk a little bit about what ecofeminism is, and draw on some of the really important and exciting sort of deep insights that Arnika has about the work and my own work with other animals. And I wanted to bring in chimpanzees because I work with chimpanzees. I also love and work with dogs, and there's a lot of dogs in Araya's work. But I wanted to share a number of insights about chimpanzees. So I'm just going to have this particular image. Some of you may have seen it in National Geographic some years ago. One of the things that I think is so exciting and important about the work here is the ways in which self and other, death and desire, and other sort of incongruous, potentially incongruous notions come to play one against the other. And this is interestingly a part of what ecofeminist theory and praxis is about. So I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I do, I want to talk more about death in a slightly different register, and draw on one of the things that Araya says in the class 1, where she's speaking to the corpses, and she says, oh, you need more time to think. Oh, you need more time to think. And she's doing this as a classroom performance, and so we recognize in a classroom, when you call on a student and they don't answer you, you say, yeah, you need more time to think. But there's something deeper, I think, that's being said. And there's some really, I think, important and interesting way of thinking about what that means, sort of in terms of the harm that death represents. Because indeed, when one is dead, one has no more time to think. And so, it does seem that that is one of the harms that death is. I want to say a little bit about the Epicurean puzzle of death in a second, but I want to highlight the way that the dead can't think is often connected to the ways that other animals can't think. And so the dead come into connection with other animals through the notion that these other animals can't think. But in the case of humans, not being able to think, and we see this also in the profoundly sort of unsettling, I guess, work of with the women in the mental institutions, there's a sense in which not being able to think is a dehumanizing move. And so in some ways, there's no human left in these corpses. And I think that that's actually a very sort of useful idea that comes out of some of this work. It also tracks with this Epicurean puzzle that I wanted to mention. And the Epicurean puzzle is a puzzle that philosophers have long tried to figure out. Who's harmed by death? Because when death comes, you're no longer. So there's no one there to be harmed by the failure or ending or cessation of thinking. And that has led to all sorts of different ways of thinking about, well, what represents the harm and when does it occur? Because we do think of death as a harm. What I love about Araya's series of classroom works is that there is no, that the death isn't the end. Right? The thinking ends, but the death itself doesn't, the living and the death, I think, is really profoundly connected. But also, and I think, about what the harm that death is, if it is a harm, is that it fails to recognize that the harm of death is largely a social harm. And what I mean by death being a social harm is sort of there's multiple ways of thinking about death as a social harm. Of course, we all, those of us who are in relationship with dogs, with chimpanzees, with other people who have died, our social relations change profoundly. But in a more abstract way, in thinking about our mortal lives and thinking there's an end to our thinking, we can actually be socially harmed by the possibility that there will be no more thinking at all. And I think that that is something that is being played with in the class series. The class series is playing with the idea that yes, you need more time to think is an important feature of the problematic, if you will. But it also shows that these things can be challenged if we recognize that death is a social harm. And when we think about death as a social harm, we also are then presented with the fact that there is already so much death, mass death and dying in our society. And I think we see this deeply and profoundly in Pray Bless Us with Rice and Curry, our great boon of 2012. So I think that this is a really important set of, and unique set of insights that are brought together to think differently about our relationship, our social relationships of the living with the dead. And I think one of the things I wanted to highlight is this kind of awareness in these chimpanzees. The chimpanzee in the wheelbarrow here has died. And the humans who are caretaking at the sanctuary in Cameroon are showing the other chimpanzees in the group that this individual has died. And so one of the things that I think is quite interesting is the ways in which thinking about this particular sort of possibility that other animals can recognize that there is some loss in the death of another really raises interesting questions about the point that I raised at the beginning, whether or not other animals think. Of course, other animals do think. I think that's an important part of the work that we're seeing. They think, they feel, they experience and express themselves in all of these sort of varieties of ways. But they also grieve and mourn. And so I did want to bring the idea of animal grief and human grief together just a little bit to highlight the ways in which the act of grief, at least in the West, has been sequestered. We're not allowed to grieve in a social way, even if death is a social harm. And grief is also feminized in an important sense. And one of the things that I think is very important in thinking about how do we address social harms that death sort of evokes is how do we recognize and make the lives of those who have died grievable. And to make the lives of those who have died grievable, we have to express a certain kind of mourning. If this is a social acknowledgement of the life and death as a grievable one, then we have to, in some way, enact a relationship with death and dying that evokes grief and mourning. And I think part of the work of failing to abide by the boundary between the living and the dead is a way of expressing a certain kind of reverence and another way of mourning for those that have died. And this is actually what ecofeminism is really about. So I want to talk a little bit in a short amount of time, really, about what ecofeminism is and why I think it was such a great idea to think about ecofeminism in the context of Araya's work. Okay, so let me say what ecofeminism is. Okay, so what is ecofeminism? Ecofeminism is an evolving praxis that's based on intersectional understandings of the construction of the other. And what that means is that what we're thinking about is the ways in which power, control, privilege, and all variety of structures that distinguish the self and the other, and put that dualism between self and other into a value dualism where the self is higher than the other, these forms of connection, what we call the logic of domination, is actually very closely connected to, in each instance, in the instance of women and their desire, in the instance of animals and humans. And I think, again, if you haven't seen, it's hard, in some sense, it's a hard one to watch, but if you haven't seen Pray Bless Us with Rice and Curry, Our Great Moon, you'll see that the complexity of the sort of relationships and the relationality that we have with other animals is really on display there. Another thing that's really centrally important about ecofeminism is recognizing what we tend to call interbeing across socially constructed boundaries of nation and class and race and species and sexuality and gender and age and ability and perhaps even between life and death if we want to bring in part of this idea of blurring the boundary between the living and the dead and recognizing ourselves in these social relations between the living and the dead. And another feature of ecofeminism that I just wanted to highlight, because I've been working a lot on it, and it raises specifically difficult questions about those that aren't living, but I can't suggest that we can be engaged in entangled empathy, and I'm going to say what that is in a minute, with those who are no longer alive. But we can be in entangled empathy with all forms of other animals and the ways in which they're able to express themselves, whether they can think or not think, or whether they can think concepts like we think concepts. And so one of the things that I just wanted to highlight about entangled empathy and to focus on specifically the animal element is the ways in which entangled empathy provides us with a connection and this back and forth that you were talking about, this back and forth between the subjectivity of the one and the subjectivity of the other. Entangled empathy begins with the recognition that we're already in a variety of complicated relationships with each other and with other animals, and perhaps with the dead. But we are all involved in these complicated relationships of power, of love, of desire, of consumption, with all sorts of other beings. And we need to be paying attention to the ways in which these relationships can be better or worse. And I think that we see see a lot of that in the work here. We need to pay attention to the particularity and the complexity of the lived experience of the other, and see that our subjectivity can put us into a very complicated relationship back and forth between the two. And this involves a certain amount of perspective taking, understanding another's world from their perspective. And art is a beautiful way in which we can do that, stories and tales, and also a recognition of the Umwelt, if you will. This is a term about the life world of the other. And I think that the images that we see of a paralyzed dog playing is precisely the kind of images that evokes a call for empathy and recognition is just behind. And so one of the things that is central in developing this notion of critical attention to the broader conditions of our lives and our deaths, our harms, our suffering, our desires, our playfulness, is that we need to fundamentally look to what's undermining well-being and reconstructing and reconfiguring our desires. And I believe very strongly that the well-being and flourishing of other animals is an important part of what makes us better seers, better perceivers, better engagers and actors and agents with the world. And it's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to actually try to understand and empathize with the perspective of the other. It requires a constant shift between the first personal and the third personal. And it also is very hard to do that if you think that the other isn't able to feel or experience. And so one of the things that I find most provocative about this work, and I'm just sort of enlightened and delighted by, is the way in which the other comes to life, even the dead.
Thank you. Presentations, and I think there's a lot of praise. And so we'll have a little discussion, and then we'll have time for a few questions too. So definitely jump in if there's something that you really want to know. And we raised a lot of issues around mourning, interspecies relationships, the social role of death, and I think just to start with Araya's work, she really uses, even though her work is largely image-based, she's really using this work of storytelling, and she creates these spaces in which another can speak, even if it's not audible language. She's really playing with and investigating different forms of communication and the potentials for that communication. And so I just really want to, and she does this with different classes, the mentally ill, animals, the dead. These are really this sort of subjectivities that she's dealing with. So I first wanted to ask Lori about the importance of storytelling in ecofeminist discourse, and there's some theorists like Karen Davis who works with chickens, and Deborah Slicer who's working with horses, and they really, I think it's compelling in their scholarship is that they include their own experiences with working with these non-human animals and sort of the gendered role of storytelling and its importance within ecofeminism.
So this is my love. Her name is Emma, and she is a chimpanzee who's now in sanctuary in Louisiana, and she's also a chimpanzee who was originally in cognition research, which is not invasive at all. It's about trying to figure out what a non-linguistic being might be thinking, and so one of the things that I like to do in thinking about empathy and how we develop and engage in empathy is tell stories about Emma. And I'm going to tell a story. and then I meta-theorize about storytelling. And so one of the things that, so I've known Emma since she was quite young. She is a chimpanzee who was raised and treated as if she were a human child, so it's what we call enculturated. It's not a fantastic thing for the chimpanzee to be sort of so connected up with human behavior and human interactions. But she did live with other chimpanzees, so she wasn't alone. So she lived with humans and other chimpanzees, and that made her chimpanzee self a chimpanzee self. But she's very connected to me, and I don't see her often. She lives in Louisiana now, but whenever I do see her in her social group of other chimpanzees, I bring her gifts, and the gifts are always now expected. She takes these gifts, and on one occasion. A woman who's been working with chimpanzees and started this sanctuary chimp haven observed Emma gathering a bouquet of flowers. They were really just weed-like blooming things from her enclosure, and handing me this bouquet through the enclosure, because we don't engage like this anymore. This is dangerous. She was quite young when she was in my arms, and I was younger too. But this was a remarkable story because the director of Chimp Haven at the time had never seen anything like this kind of behavior, this gift giving, this reciprocity. And it raises all sorts of important and interesting questions about what could really be going on here. And so the role that storytelling plays is that it helps us to figure out what might be going on in the world of the non-linguistic. And I think that's also the role that art well. And so storytelling is the kind of thing that we need to be able to move into the Umwelt, to be able to move into the perspective of a non-linguistic other. There's not much else that we have to go on. And I think that ultimately the stories that we tell are going to help us to understand and engage in those relationships in sort of different and perhaps more meaningful ways. The thing also that I want to say about storytelling and the role it plays in ecofeminism is that ecofeminism is interested in epistemologies that are and have been subordinated epistemologies, how it is that you come to know what you know. And the way that we traditionally think about how we come to know whether another animal thinks or feels is through science and scientific practices. And so ecofeminism has been very critical of that as the only modality of knowledge production, as the only epistemology that we have access to. And as Mark Beckhoff, who is actually a scientist and an ethologist, often says, sort of the plural of stories is data. So if we think about storytelling not as some subordinate epistemology, but as a form of knowledge production that gives us special insight into sort of the worlds of others, it's going to play a very important role. Another thing about storytelling. Fundamentally, ecofeminism is about relationality, and the way in which we are in these relationships is ultimately going to be understood by those who are perhaps more distant from those relationships by the stories that we tell.
And I think it's, this is sort of like, there's a lot of specificity also within Araya's work, and then sort of the group acknowledgement of mourning and death, and a lot of most of the corpses are anonymous. You can't really tell even their genders at times where I'm living. And in Praying Blessings with Rice and Curry, Araya is juxtaposing footage of these dogs that have been rounded up in Thailand, some street dogs, even pets, people who exchange their dogs for plastic buckets, and this is news footage she's interspersing with it's tragic, horrifying, with the sort of specifics of her daily interaction with the dogs, where she actually cooks a barbecue of meat, which one critic in the New York Times points out is like potentially hypocritical, but yeah, it's which is another thing to think about. But she is cooking this barbecue and throwing a party. So there's a lot of like celebration in the work, and there's a lot of ambiguity with there's joy, there's suffering, and she even has one of the dogs in the video carry a lantern on his back to honor all these nameless dogs that have been killed, and so this sort of gesture, I think, is sort of this kind of cultural acts of mourning. And Araya actually worked, and you cited this, Arnika, in your text, where she said she couldn't make work about life anymore, so she turned to making work about death, and now her recent work is really focused on dogs, and she told me that was because they do represent this sort of sheer life force and vitality. And I know you work more with the corpse work, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that sort of shift and how it's sort of her work is embodying more complexity of emotion and experience in that transition.
That's a really difficult question and a really good question, I think. I think some of the work comes into being in parallel. It's like it's kind of overlapping. And I don't really know why she stopped making videos with corpses. Do you know? Has she said anything?
She's really taking the time with them. I think it's fascinating in her work because I think it's a performative time. It's exhausting. She's really performing a ritual with the corpses, and I think she just couldn't do it.
She couldn't do it. Yeah. So at first she said she could no longer make work about life, but only about death. So now she always in interviews or her catalog text sort of spoke about the toll that the work took on her, as well as her need to continue it. So maybe something has been fulfilled. In what I just presented, I think I tried to see more continuity between the different types of work and the different sort of objects that she focuses on in her work, than the differences. But I'm not completely sure how I would it's just a liberation. I mean, one thing that I'm quite sure of is that in order for a Thai female artist to have made it as far as she has, to have received as much recognition, to have gone to the Documenta in, I think, 3 years ago, for that she had to make this work with corpses in a morgue. I think it was the thing that catapulted her into sort of national, regional, international consciousness. That I'm quite sure of. I don't know what your impression is about the circulation.
Interesting, actually, in terms of the reception in Thailand, which I'm aware of also, like how that, because I mean her work is so grounded in the specificity of, while she's dealing with these hugely universal, or shared experiences that she's communicating, she's also really coming from a place of autobiography.
Yes. But there's also, if I can, there's also, I think, a bit of sort of wry humor and playfulness, even in the corpse work. And I think that is so apparent in the work that she's doing with dogs as well. So there's that sort of continuity, and being able to actually overtly play.
It's something else that we can track across her work is that she takes on like all the pieties of sort of in a Thai national context. So Buddhism, male artists, dogs as something that maybe shouldn't be in the house or shouldn't be receive such focus. But also the international art world, right? So that's something that tracks throughout her work. But yeah, she's guess she's come back much more to maybe a meta perspective on art as such, and on the work that her art can do in the international art world as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting too, also when you're talking about consent, because the dog hair sculptures that are, they're basically portraits of some of the dogs she cares for, and she wanted them to participate, but they had to consent to give her their hair, and she had to like collect the hair. Because, I mean, you know, they didn't know that they were going to be in the show in New York probably, but she couldn't get much hair from some of those. They wouldn't let her. You know, others were more willing, and I think it's, you know, it's interesting to extend that dialogue around consent to that kind of, because there's that interactivity and participation, even, and space and fantasy that you're describing that's taking place, even in the space of the dog, you know, her interactions with the dogs.
So maybe she's moving from a sort of immense space of abstraction, which is death, because we don't know what it is. We can make it do all kinds of work for us. Also, I think in Thai sort of visual culture, contemporary visual culture, death is a register of the sexual. So here's one way of speaking about desire and protesting about sort of limits about that you have for the expression of women's desires. By using the register of death. And so it seems as though she's turned from a sphere of great abstraction to interaction with maybe slightly more concrete contexts, dogs that can give a little bit of consent at least.
And that just makes me think that there's also a sense in which sort of desire, if death is a standard for desire, animality is also a standard for desire. So going to animality is the way that you sort of can relocate that. So it seems again continuous.
And also this, like, I think this loneliness and solitude, or this desire for a response, a reaction, I think is really important, and it kind of gets to the, you know, Derrida's text with the, you know, the animal, the animal, therefore I am, where he's, you know, recognizing that his cat is looking at him, but he's not satisfied in a way because there isn't like a real response, and that desire for some kind of response, which has been investigated by other thinkers about the subject, but I think it sort of gets, you know, her work is centered in pedagogy and, you know, do you need time to think, and, you know, really like waiting for some kind of response, or, but alternatively, I think Araya creates a new space for a response, or, you know, what response are we expecting, or maybe we're not listening in the right way. I don't know if anyone has any questions to jump in here about this. Do you think more chance?
Yes, I'm a little interested in something that's come up, I think, is the difference between the individual and the social. Like you're talking about these corpses, you're talking about this kind of notion of consent, right? As if it's limited to the subject of the corpse, right? Where, you know, one actually, right, there are mechanisms by which a body consents to be used after death, you know, which is social institute one. But oftentimes when we think about sort of the desecration, right, of the corpse, it's about kinship, it's about family, it's about social taboo. So it seems, I don't know, it struck me as somewhat, I limited the argument to just have it down to this notion of consent. So I'm wondering about the tension between the kind of, you know, consent of the individual to the kind of social norms and sort of social practices that this work touches on. And likewise, the question of the sort of storytelling. You know, when you talk about, like, say, Blumenbelt's, like, I imagine you're thinking of, like, Heidegger's wonderful text on a tick, but, you know, trying to isolate what that individual subject is like. But I wonder, it's right, storytelling insists or doesn't insist, but often I presume some sort of individualized subject experience, which is to say, perhaps more normalizing things or adding that kind of sense of a stable, individualized subject, as opposed to something that might be more social. So I'm just wondering, both in kind of your work, the sort of move between the individual and some sort of broader social collective sense of the subject.
Okay, so yeah, that's a really important idea. I think one of the things that's sort of central part of sort of ecofeminist thought and feminist thought more generally about the self is that there's a sense in which the individualized self is a problematic and somewhat fallacious way of thinking about subjectivity, because we're in these relationships and we're in relationships of various forms of dependency and interdependency, so it just doesn't make sense to think about like an ontologically prior individual self. At the same time, achieving self, certainly for a woman in a female artist in the Thai context, but in general, it is an achievement. And so the idea that we're going to just dissolve the self is something that a lot of feminists would be loath to do. And so the central idea of the self within sort of thinking about entangled empathy is to recognize that the self is a product of what Karen Barad, philosopher of physics, talks about as these intra-actions, these entangled intra-actions. There's no self that can exist prior to its interactions with others, and is always shaped. But the self can maintain, can be the organizer of certain sort of perceptions, not ever independent of the social. So the social self or the relational self is the sort of self that's going on in context of storytelling. And when we're thinking about the subjectivity of another, it's actually quite important to maintain that dialectic between the self and the other, so that we're not just projecting or doing anything anthropomorphizing, as you say. So I think that's really right. That's exactly right.
Maybe one way of thinking about consent and the social would be to say, well, what might be the consent of the viewer of death for now, because it's art, it's video. And I think that has, in the history of her exhibition, that has changed a lot between where she exhibited. So thinking that she first maybe aimed for Thailand as her site of exhibition, so as her sort of social site in which to present this work, I think it was jarring to people, like surprising to people, but I don't think there was much opposition to the imaging of dead bodies. And she actually goes through an ethics board. She went through an ethics board to get permission to do this. And the stories that she recounts of people like dragging their children out of a show or something are not from Thailand. So I think where she doesn't have such broad social consensus maybe about her work is how she is the way in which she uses this as her platform, or as her sort of almost playing ground for a certain feminist presentation of desire. And I think that's where she's. And so one thing that has happened, for instance, was that all the Thai male artists who were sort of her age and more established would try to relegate all her work and some other similar work by women to the sphere of the private. They would say, oh, this is just private. Like everything you see here, which may not necessarily strike you as private, may not be your first thought. They said, oh, it's just private. She's just concerned with like small private things. And so one thing that she's always done is to create a sort of pedagogy and discourse around her own art, and then to write columns, to take up these instances and sort of develop a pedagogy around that. So maybe that's one way of saying something about consent and the social and consensus, and trying to rupture a consensus on what should be where, when, exactly those issues of privacy and publicity. So yeah, it's been a breach of privacy to show these works, but maybe not for reasons of showing a corpse. So if you ride your motorcycle too fast in Bangkok and the police catches you, they will, even today, so this is a very modern practice, you ride your motorcycle very fast. They catch you, they might take you to a hospital morgue to look at corpses, to try to teach you. So, so in a sense, I guess, death at least used to be very visible in Thailand, and not shut away and shut off and out of sight. And today everyone would still be conscious of the ways in which Buddhist pedagogy uses images of women's bodies and their impermanence, their sort of decay or something, as sort of the primary instance of the futility of desire. So if this is going to happen to, you know, someone who looks really good to you soon, you shouldn't be attached to them. So it's that type of thing. You know, Buddhism is also so diverse in Thailand that all kinds of things happen. Some people might actually go and meditate on corpses. Other people would make a film about the changeability, the malleability of women's bodies. So it's a trope that's very widespread and very familiar, but it appears in very diverse ways. For a woman to make this kind of work a long time ago, I don't think so. I mean, I think she was the only female artist in her class, right? Yeah, there are a couple of others in her age bracket, but not too many. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the role of pedagogy is so important too, in thinking about this work, and I think, well, you know, and I just wanted to ask Lori a little bit about like this. So just generally, there's this cultural visibility of death that is being raised that I think is really important to acknowledge, and different cultural understandings of death, and relationships to like when someone is considered dead and when they're not, and if the spirit's still there, is there a spirit? Like, there's so many questions around death. It's not really as cut and dry as it may seem for people that there's sort of social sphere around it. And I think it also this somehow ties in with something that you heard about, Lori, in terms of like this necessity for death in order to live, and the kind of conundrum in which we, just to be alive, there are beings that are that have to die, and how much do we acknowledge that, and how do we acknowledge it, and that's also a culturally specific notion as well. So.
Yeah, I was going to sort of riff on this. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is interesting in some Buddhist practice is that you spend more time with corpses. You just spend more time. The mourning process is elaborated, and you're with corpses in a longer way. And I was doing this sort of mourning workshop with Aiko and a colleague of mine who's a Buddhist, and it was around the time that one of my dogs was dying, and I thought of the idea of maybe having my dog's corpse around for a while longer than we're used to in the West, and it was near impossible to do because we don't have the habit or the practice or the familiarity with that boundary. And Aiko was saying at that point too that she was just stunned when a friend of hers, a human friend of hers, died, and immediately the corpse was taken away. And that's something that's really very different about the ways in which we, in this context, end up think we just push death aside. We really can't really cope with death or with corpses. But this gets to what we're asking about. We deal with animal corpses in a constant onslaught of animal corpses all the time. They're cut into bits and what have you, and you see body parts all around. But it's a very interesting juxtaposition. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to bring, at least in the culture, in a Western culture, is to bring the practice of grief and mourning into our daily awareness and not to sequester it, to recognize that we are living amongst complex dying, And so to really not keep it as sequestered, to develop practices in which the mourning can happen, and it can also have a wry wit in the way that the grief rituals in the classes series work. So I think it's an interesting difference between East and West, or at least between Buddhist and more Judeo-Christian sort of ways of thinking about dying. But one of the things I'm really worried about is because, and this goes back to an important insight that Judith Butler had, that there's certain ways in which power and privilege makes certain bodies grievable, and insofar as that makes their life livable and understandable and intelligible. And so the failure to grieve and the failure to mourn is a disavowal. It's a failure to acknowledge the meaning of the life that was, and I would argue the relationships that are and are now different as a result of the loss.
Do you think it's unethical that Araya feeds her dogs?
Dogs? I don't know if she's feeding her dogs.
Well, I mean, it's just because someone did raise that. I mean, it's kind of interesting in terms of that question, that conundrum. I mean, I'm kind of being provocative. Yeah.
I think it's a very startling, like a lot of the work, it's a very startling juxtaposition. It raises really profound questions. It raises the questions in ways that people tend to. So the vegans who don't eat any animal products at all tend to imagine that they're living life without death, and I think that that's just wrong. That's not actually possible. But that doesn't mean it's not useful to try your best not to engage in certain kinds of harmful practices that cause death. It's just to acknowledge that death is something that is to some extent unavoidable in a variety of ways. Other animals, I mean, the issue of sort of being in relationship with other animals that eat other animals is just it's a complicated one, and I think that one's participation in these systems just has to be mindful. So I think, another feature of ecofeminism is that it's a contextual ethic, so it's going to largely depend. What challenged me the first time I saw the video was I didn't know because the video is also interspliced with these images of dogs being rounded up to go and be killed for consumption, right? That's part of what's the trouble of that video. So I didn't know if that's what was happening. And then so it became not, feeding the dogs meat in a sort of general way, but more some sort of consumption of each other, which was mediated through her. And I thought, that was jarring. I didn't.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Can you talk about Araya access to corpses for these books?
Her access to the corpses. So she went through an ethics board at this hospital in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. Then if there are families, the families would be contacted and they would give their consent or not. Also, if there were no families, then I think the doctors just decided. She always wanted to make films with women, but in that case, the families were more reluctant to release the corpses. She also, so while her work may not be Buddhist in a sort of doctrinal or direct sense, while it might be much more an improvisation on forms or a sort of drawing on forms, she did donate coffins, for instance, for unclaimed corpses and things like that.
Thank you, Lori and Arnika, so much for coming here and talking with us, and thank you all for coming. We have a few snacks in the lobby, and feel free to take a moment to look at the videos. Thank you.